In this video, I'm going to go over some paper 2 advice. This is supposed to be general advice for argumentative, analytical, academic writing, but I'll specifically connect it with the paper number 2 prompt. So we'll touch on the purpose or the criteria of the assignment, the prompt in question. I'll talk about summarizing, in particular, how much to summarize, what exactly you might summarize. We'll focus on going beyond summary to make an argument, including choosing an interesting and arguable main claim, one that focuses on depth over breadth, and we'll say a bit about arguments and objections, and then end with some thoughts on writing more generally. Okay, let's briefly talk about the purpose of this kind of assignment. This is a pretty traditional college level argumentative analytical writing assignment. So in order to figure out what makes a good paper, we might ask about the purpose of the paper. That might sound familiar from Aristotle, right? So what is the purpose of writing a paper like this? Why even assign something like this? So we write for a bunch of reasons. One important reason we write is in order to understand. Writing is part of the process of coming to understand and figuring out and questioning and analyzing and evaluating and drawing conclusions. So writing is part of the process of learning. So we can write for ourselves. And we can write to demonstrate that we do understand and have thought about it and can think critically and clearly and draw conclusions and all of that good stuff. So we also write to demonstrate our knowledge and skill. So in a sense, you're writing for your instructors and they're going to grade you on the basis of your ability to demonstrate what you understand and what you can do. We also write in order to connect with others. We write in order to explain things to people and to convince people of things or to persuade. We could write to entertain or to inspire. We can write for all kinds of reasons. So importantly, these are purposes or reasons that have to do with writing for others. And we're often asked to think about who our reader is when we're writing something like this. And sometimes that can feel disingenuous because who is our reader? Our reader is our instructor, and they are looking to evaluate us, and it feels super overwhelming sometimes, right? So why think about who your reader is when really no one's gonna read this? And that can feel kind of defeating, right? Well, imagining that you are writing for a reader can help you to demonstrate what you know and your skills, both in thinking about what you know and in communicating that clearly to others. So in one sense, it's a device, and thinking about this can help you to write better. And a good reader to have in mind is somebody who is interested and sympathetic, but also doesn't have all the time in the world and might get maybe he's a little bit lazy. But maybe imagine a smart, interested, curious high school student. If you're writing for this kind of reader, well, in order to do a really good job of explaining what needs to be explained, explaining your own reasoning, and of developing an argument that they can connect with and understand, in order to do a good job of that, you have to have good understanding yourself, and you have to have thought about what you're saying in detail. And if you can explain that clearly and convincingly at a level a high school student could understand, you will, in so doing, demonstrate your understanding and ability to think about this stuff. So pretending that you're writing for someone can be useful, and also it's good practice because maybe you will write for real readers on topics that you care about, and this could be good practice for doing that. But at the very least, it is an opportunity to deepen your own understanding, thinking, and learning of this topic. So So what are the criteria for a good paper, given that we have this sort of manifold of goals? So especially focusing on the fact that a goal is to go through the process of understanding and thinking and demonstrating your knowledge. Well, what is it you're supposed to be understanding and thinking about? And what is it you're supposed to be demonstrating? Well, we have spent well over a month on a specific set of material. We've been reading Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and so you should be deeply engaged with that, right? So part of the task is to deepen your understanding and critical thinking about what we have been reading about. So a major criterion for a good paper is that it demonstrates not just that you know what you talk about, that you know about, these topics or hopefully the arguments within the readings that were assigned, but that you understand them deeply, that you have read them. You didn't just read a SparkNotes summary or something like that, that you have read the text and you've thought about them, and then you have something to say as a result of reading them, right? The argument that you're going to give isn't one you could have written a month ago. What you have to say should engage with or be a product of thinking about this background conversation, the arguments that we've been reading. So it's not just an interesting claim in an argument that comes out of nowhere, made in a complete void. It is deeply connected with and grounded in the stuff we've read. And then finally, we should be able to communicate that in clear, compelling writing. So I'll go on to say a bit more about quality of argument and quality of writing in a moment. Okay, so the prompt is, what is a good life for a human being? And an important point here is that the word good has more than one meaning. We might hear that and think, what is a morally good life? How should we live according to the dictates of morality or something like that? And alternatively, we might mean something like, what is a happy or pleasant or maybe the word choice-worthy kind of life for a human being? And one of the important features of a view like Plato's or Aristotle's is that these turn out to be the same thing, but that's not how we often think about a good life. So when you're asked to respond to this prompt by engaging with Plato and Aristotle, one of the things you are essentially dealing with is the question of whether or not these really are the same thing. And what exactly is this morally good, happy life? What does it look like? They make specific claims about that, but importantly is this claim that they turn out to be the same thing. Now, this isn't our common sense or the most common view of the nature of morality. And so when this comes up in Book 1 of Plato's Republic, we get this claim that the unjust person will be better off for being unjust. Like, that's not the original question we start with in Book 1, but that's where we end up, and that is one of the most important questions of the text. Are you potentially better off if you can get away with being unjust? And the key claim that Plato and Aristotle are both making is that the answer is no. That if you think this here, that happiness is all it takes, where what you have in mind is something like a life that is filled with lots of pleasures or freedom to do whatever you want, not just freedom, but this certain kind of freedom, the freedom to do anything you want whatsoever, or to have lots of things, or to have lots of comfort, or to experience lots of pleasure. If that is your conception of a happy life, it does seem like it comes apart from the claim about what you morally ought to do, such that maybe morality is like bad medicine, a thing we have to do but can conflict with our being happy, and that there's actually like reasons to not be morally good that can lead to you being extra happy because you'll have more power, money, and stuff, or something like that. And that is the claim that Plato is focused on denying. The whole Republic is about denying this claim, and then Aristotle also denies this claim, and they both give arguments, and they give different arguments. Their views are very similar in some ways in that they equate these things, but they give very different arguments. So your task is to be able to explain their arguments for this and also evaluate them and draw a conclusion about what we should take away from the arguments that they give. Should we be convinced? Should we reject them? Is there some problem with them that we can sort of point out but still take away something important from their view? So what exactly is it we should think about the arguments we see for this claim? Now, one piece of advice that I have is to not get too bogged down in the details of things they say about how exactly it is that we should live, especially when you're writing about Plato, where he has a sort of indirect and perhaps unfamiliar to most of you argumentative strategy for making this claim that the morally good, the just life is also the happy life, the life where you are best off as a human being. He has a very indirect way of getting to this claim, and it involves saying a lot about the ideal city, right? And don't get lost in all of the minutia of organizing the city. Stick with the big ideas and the making the overarching argument as clear as possible. And the big idea is that justice, there is a substantive claim about the nature of justice. It's not just social norms imposed by those with the most power. It is not just something that we rationally agree to because we're vulnerable. There is a deeper conception of justice or morality that is on offer here. And then there is also the claim that we are happier and better off for becoming this kind of person, right? And the ideal city is part of a strategy for saying what this conception of justice is, and then he goes on to argue that we are better off for being just, that's actually, again, equivalent to how we should think about a truly happy life for a human being. So insofar as you do get into the details of how people would live in the ideal city, think about the sort of, don't get lost in the minutia again, just to repeat myself. So focus on the big ideas and the arguments and the ultimate claim here. And again, when you answer this question, what is a good life for a human being, don't just go off on a tangent or get, on your own sort of conception of a good life for a human being that is given out of nowhere with zero connection or limited connection to the views of Plato and Aristotle, because the essential goal of this assignment is to deepen your understanding of the view that they are arguing for and to think about it critically, to identify interesting questions and reason your way through it and ultimately draw a conclusion. So don't just focus on answering this question, focus on thinking about how Plato and Aristotle answer that question and what you think of their attempts to do that. Ultimately, you're asked to make an arguable claim. Your claim doesn't have to be a direct answer to this question. It can be a claim about either or both of Aristotle or Plato's view. It could be a claim about a specific kind of argument they make. It could be a claim about what we should take away from the arguments given your analysis and evaluation. And in general, you should go for depth over breadth. You should choose something to focus on And insofar as you are focused on something, you can't talk about everything because that's the opposite of focus, right? So you don't have to show that you understand and have read and thought about every single thing. Instead, focus your paper so that you can fully present, analyze, and critically examine and reason through something. But we'll return to this question, or this claim that we should be focused, how to actually do that in a little bit here. Okay, so you're definitely going to be engaging with both Plato and or Aristotle. You're going to be writing about their views, analyzing their views. So you're definitely going to have to give summary. And in most of your college level analytical argumentative papers, not just philosophy ones, but most courses require you to write argumentative papers, you're often told that you should go beyond summary. And so I wanted to say a bit about how much should you summarize and what does that mean? What does it mean to go beyond? So let's start with how much summary is appropriate. And I'll give you a concrete answer and a squishy answer. So the concrete answer is you're going to do a lot of it. It'll probably be, like, it wouldn't be surprising if it was half your paper or more than half of your paper. So there should be a good deal of explaining arguments and summarizing things. But the more general answer, insofar as this advice should apply to all kinds of analytical argumentative writing, the answer to how much is it depends. It depends on your purpose. Why are you summarizing what it is that you're summarizing? You aren't just telling the reader all the things you know. You're telling the reader what they need to know in order to understand what it is that you ultimately have to say, to understand your argument or whatever the purpose of your paper is, right? So when it comes to our particular paper here, the prompt at hand, you are supposed to be critically analyzing and evaluating Plato and Aristotle's arguments. So you're summarizing the things that you're about to analyze and evaluate. So you have a clear purpose. Your purpose is to summarize so that you can go on to analyze and evaluate. Anything that gets presented in the paper should be presented for a reason. You should end up saying something about it. It should be okay. You ultimately want to evaluate the argument and draw conclusions and develop a point of view that you support, right? So you're summarizing what it is that you are going to go on to evaluate and draw conclusions about. You should, as a general rule, summarize before you analyze and evaluate. It would be a mistake to run these two things together. First, you present the thing that you want to talk about, and then you go on to talk about it. Now, if you're going to be summarizing a lot, now you have a writerly choice to make. Are you going to do all summary? Maybe you have different arguments you're going to summarize. Maybe Plato has more than one argument, and indeed he does, or Aristotle and Plato have different arguments and you summarize this setup and then you go on to evaluate, or do you summarize and then evaluate the thing you just summarized and then summarize the next thing and then evaluate that? It depends. Maybe there's a choice that's in between these two options, but in any case, it's still a general rule that you will, before you evaluate a thing, you will summarize that thing. Okay, the next point about summarizing I want to make is about summarizing arguments. So whenever you're summarizing, you're presenting something, someone else said, but people say different kinds of things. Sometimes they give arguments. What are some other things that we might summarize? So we might be writing about and thus summarizing a series of events or a story or some other kind of thing. And what a summary looks like, how you should organize it, depends on the logical structure of those things. So a series of events, they happen in an order. Oftentimes there's a cause-effect relationship, but maybe it's just a list, maybe it's a process or a set of instructions. That will have one kind of logical structure. A story will have, I guess, a beginning, a middle, and an end, or a plot, or a rising series of events, a climax, or there will be an end. Like, the story will have a logical structure and things that are especially important to emphasize in it. And arguments have a logical structure and things that are especially important to emphasize. Arguments have two essential pieces. Arguments have conclusions or claims, and they have reasons to support those claims, and sometimes the structure of how the reasons fit together to support the claim is not always straightforward and needs to, so the structure of the summary can help to make clear the structure of the argument. And as a rule of thumb, you lead with the main claim, or whatever, if you're developing an argument that has parts, lead with the claim and then fill in the reasons for it. And when the reasons are complex, make it clear how they fit together to support the main claim. Those are the main things to emphasize. It's not just a list of things someone said in order. It's a claim and the reasons that support that claim. And whenever you're summarizing, you should be including lots of signal phrasing and citations to make it clear that you are presenting something someone else said or argued. And use signal phrasing to lead in, to sort of at the beginning, to signal I'm about to present something someone said, and then after you have presented it, provide in-text citations, like in parentheses right after. So it's kind of like sandwiching. I'm telling you the thing I'm about to say comes from someone else, and then I finish by telling you where exactly they said it. And the citations should be as specific as possible, including page numbers, or for Plato, Stephanus numbers would be appropriate. For Aristotle, just book and section would be fine because we didn't have page numbers or Becker numbers for that. Okay, you ultimately want to make an argument. And again, this argument is going to be something that develops out of your understanding, analysis, and evaluation of Aristotle and Plato's claims. So, in general, what is an interesting, arguable main claim? So, a main claim or a thesis is always the answer to a question or the solution to a problem. So we've got questions and problems. An argumentative paper will be driven or guided by some question or problem. And the claim is an answer to that question or problem. So how interesting and arguable your main claim is depends on how interesting and difficult your question is. So a good main claim answers a question that's difficult. The answer to such a question just isn't obvious. It requires thinking through something complicated and supporting your claim. There's room for reasonable disagreement. You could imagine somebody objecting to your claim because it's complicated, and you have to think critically and deeply about those objections. Your own question should be difficult for you to answer. You should be able to see the difficulties and deal with them, and deal with the complexity of answering that question in your paper. So a good claim is an answer to a complicated question. So we want to identify good questions, good, difficult, open-ended questions that we can productively reason our way through. Your question should be sufficiently narrow, so one of your goals is to go for depth rather than breadth, and one of the ways to do that is to decide how to focus your paper what are you going to focus on when you present Plato and or Aristotle's views, and what is your main claim, how to narrow it. Well, how do we come up with these questions and come up with sufficiently narrow questions when we are, like, what's the strategy? Fine, I know they should be good and I know they should be narrow, but what's my strategy for doing that? A good place to start is to just start by summarizing various arguments in the background conversation, and for us that of course is going to be Plato's and Aristotle's arguments, and summarize them as deeply as possible and maybe try to put them into standard form so that you can't come up with a really good claim that connects with this background conversation and set of arguments if you don't deeply understand it. So start by summarizing it, make sure you deeply understand it, and then think about potential objections to the overarching argument, to some lower level argument, to some sub piece of the argument. Think about potential objections and the questions that are raised by those objections. Now, an objection to an argument can take one of two forms. Either the premises don't support the conclusion, or a premise is false. So being able to identify the conclusion of an argument and the reasons to support that conclusion, and sometimes you have to fill in stuff that's implicit and spell it out. Being able to identify the structure of the argument, the conclusion and the premises, helps you to think strategically about possible objections to those arguments. We've also listed lots of objections to both Plato and Aristotle. We did this in our virtue challenge debate. The midterm should help you to review some of this stuff. So when you identify some objections, you can start to think about, are the objections good? Like, how do we think, what questions are raised in our attempt to evaluate the objections themselves? Now, the objections themselves are also arguments. They're arguments that there is a problem with the original argument. So if the claim made by some objection is that there's a false premise, well, what is the reason for thinking there's a false premise, and is it a good argument, right? The conclusion is there's a false premise, and some reasons have been given. Do those reasons support the claim? Are those reasons true? So as you start digging into objections, questions are potentially raised, and those could be the basis of the paper. Your main claim might be the answer to some question that arises as you're scrutinizing these arguments. And there's sort of a back and forth here. As I said before, you don't want to just summarize everything for no purpose, but if you don't know what your purpose is from the get-go, well, then you might start by summarizing until you find a purpose. And once you find your purpose, the question you ultimately want to focus on and make a answer and support an answer to, then you go back and revise what you've summarized to make sure you've summarized only the things needed to make this argument and everything needed to make the argument, right? So it could be a back and forth process. This is an especially good strategy for a paper like this one, where your task is to really engage with a very specific argument. But it's a good general strategy if you have to develop an argument to think about the background conversation and the various arguments made and potential objections to those arguments until you start to identify the question you're most interested in. And you can see how answering that question and the arguments you would make connect with other views. But summarizing other arguments and thinking about objections until you identify a clear, well-defined, sufficiently narrow question. That is the focus of the paper. That's my advice. Okay, so let's say that we start with just a really general question. What should we think of argument X? Where, let's just say the most general argument. So Plato makes a bunch of arguments, but his big argument is the one we looked at the outset, which is that the just life, which he gives us a definition is the best, happiest life. So the just person will be happier than the unjust person. So what should we think of the argument for this claim? Well, that's a lot. Like he took a whole book to make that argument, right? So one thing that you might do is focus on some part of the argument. So in order for this argument to work, we have to accept this let's look at some component of that argument. You might focus on that, or you might identify a particular objection that the argument faces, and your question could be, what should we think of this particular objection? So, for example, we looked at a bunch of objections. One example would be the situationist challenge is an objection to both Plato and Aristotle, maybe especially Aristotle. And what should we think of that objection? That could be a guiding question for a paper where we answer that. We could go even narrower yet and ask, what should we think of response Z? So if this is the claim that a virtuous life is actually a happy one, and this is the claim people don't have virtuous character traits, says situationist psychology, and then there's a particular response. I was there aren't that many virtuous people anyway. It's not that surprising that all of these studies would show that people lack virtue. No one said it was common. What should we think of that kind of response, right? So there's a place where you could focus your question and then ultimately make a claim that answers some focused question. And in doing this, your paper will go through a sort of series of argument. Here's a potential objection. Here's a response to that objection. How should we think about that? Response to you can continue evaluating, if there's an objection to an argument, then there's a response to that objection, and then we can consider objections to that responses. Now, you only have a few pages, so again, it's really important to be focused. And if you have focused narrowly enough, you can really deeply examine arguments, objections, responses to responses, and then ultimately draw a conclusion. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about writing more generally. A few tips for writing the paper. Start with organization. Hopefully the organization on this paper is fairly clear, and I put some tips for organization into the instructions for the paper itself. So at a first pass, and I'm talking about the body of the paper here, we know we ultimately, or not ultimately necessarily, but we know that one very important part of the paper is going to be to present Plato and or Aristotle's argument. So their main claim, very, very broadly. You could get more specific in spelling out their claim and the arguments for their claims, but something along the lines of the virtuous or just life is also the happiest, best life. So you know that you're going to want to summarize arguments here. So claim and argument. And then you might start by giving the background required to set up where that claim and argument is coming from. And Plato himself does that, so it's a natural place to begin. So this would be referring essentially to something like Glaucon's argument, which, as I suggested in the instructions, you might also add on sort of contemporary ways of thinking about morality, justice, and happiness, right? These views do seem to fit with our own. So setting up the context for this claim and argument, presenting the argument, and then where you go from here will depend on what you've chosen to focus on. So if you've chosen to focus on, say, Aristotle in the situationist challenge, then maybe this part is pretty short so that you can use this as a basis for introducing Aristotle's views, and that will be the focus of your paper. If you were to do that, then transition to A, where now all of this is really background and context. And you transition to Aristotle, and you now present his claims and arguments, right? Whereas if you're sticking mostly with Plato and you're going to talk about ideal cities and stuff, you're going to want to go further into depth in presenting Plato's arguments, right? So if your plan is to focus on Aristotle, don't write a ton about ideal cities. So choose what to summarize based on where you're going to focus your paper. Okay, so once you've got the setup, the background, the context, and you've summarized the relevant arguments that you're going to be talking about, maybe the rest of the paper is organized around considering whether you think they're good objections or not. Begin by considering objections, and keep in mind that objections are themselves arguments. They're not just alternative claims. And then, whether you agree with the objection or not, respond to objections, and these responses are themselves going to be arguments. You're going to be evaluating the objection, making a claim about the quality of this objection, and giving reasons to support it. So again, this is another bit of reasoning that's going to go here. What should we think of the objection? Maybe there's a potential response to your response to that objection, so maybe there's more reasoning to engage in here. And where do we ultimately end up? What ultimately you have a point to make. So that would be a pretty natural way to organize this paper. Well, let's move on to thinking about the introduction. So here's a way of thinking about the introduction and its relationship to the paper. So the purpose of the introduction is to introduce the rest of the paper. That's one way to think about it. It's also to introduce the topic, the question, the main claim. More on that in a second. But one way to think about it is, after reading the introduction, I have a good sense of what is going to happen in this paper. I know what the motivating question is. Maybe it wasn't explicitly stated, but I have a good sense of what is in question here. I have a good sense of what you're going to say because you've told me, you've stated your main claim in the introduction. I know, basically I know what to expect. So here's one way to think about it. This is a picture of a paper. This is the introductory paragraph. And in a short paper like this, a 5-pager, an introductory section is 1 paragraph. Maybe in longer papers, it takes more than one, but it's basically going to be 1 paragraph for a short paper like this. So if this is the introductory paragraph, and this, if we use the layout we discussed in the previous bullet point, this will be the background or context for the arguments you're going to be introducing and evaluating. If you were to physically cut the introductory section of the paper off, the paper would still stand alone. Like everything that needs to be said in the paper, including all the background and the context and stuff, it's still in the paper. And likewise, if I just hand you the introduction, I have a good sense of what's going to be in the body of the paper. That's a pretty standard way to organize what goes into the introduction. And the introduction should definitely include a clear statement of your main claim. What else should go in the introduction? You should have a clear statement of the main claim. Whatever comes before it is the job of whatever sentences are before the main claim, is to motivate or provide context for the main claim. Where is this claim coming from? Now, since a main claim is the answer to a question or the solution to a problem, one way to introduce the context is to introduce a question or a problem. You don't have to do this explicitly, but it might be a natural thing to do. So one thing you might do is introduce the question and then introduce competing views and then state yours. Make a main claim. That's a thing you could do. Alternatively, you might begin by introducing the competing view and then introduce an objection to that view, one that you think maybe is ultimately good or somehow gets you to your main claim, right? If you're going to introduce the competing view, maybe you can give an indication about what are you going to say about that view or what's wrong with it or something like that. Somehow, you, insofar as you've got something to say, what is the context for understanding that? It can look like a lot of different things. Okay, so let's recap: motivate the main claim, provide context, and definitely provide a clear statement of your main claim. Here's another way of thinking about why this is such a common strategy. Think of, if this helps, go with it. If not, don't worry about it. But think of your main claim as the protagonist of the paper, and think of whatever you use to set it up as the obstacle that it needs to overcome. There's a question that needs to be answered, a problem that needs to be solved, an alternative view that needs to be beaten, or something like that. So setting up, what is the challenge for your main claim? Why should anyone care about your main claim, right? There's an interesting question that we should all care about. What is it? Okay, the last thing that I want to say about the introductory paragraph is what's that first sentence? What makes for a great first sentence? That's really difficult to answer. What's much easier to answer is what makes for a terrible first sentence. A terrible first sentence is super generic, and you can tell that a sentence is generic if you could stick it onto the beginning of any paper and it would make just as much sense on any other paper. So the standard example of a super generic, terrible first sentence is a since the beginning of time sentence, or any sentence that tells you this thing has been important for a long time, or it has a history of being important. Even if that's true, and if you get into the details, that's it. For the most part, this is a generic sentence. You could stick this, even if we have something kind of specific for our X here, like people have disagreed about the nature of morality or happiness or whether or not, like even then, that could go on. You guys are all writing papers, right? But presumably you're going to have different angles or a different focus, and this paper could go on any single person, or this sentence could go at the beginning of any single person in the class's paper responding to this prompt. So it's generic. Also, most of the stuff that for some reason we learn when we're in high school about what makes for a good first sentence is just plain wrong. Like you get told that you need a hook, and hooks include things like a quotation or a question or a challenge, and for the most part those things just feel cheesy and out of place and don't help to motivate the main claim of this paper. So I don't know what advice to give you to write a great first sentence. This is some advice for how to not write a super sucky first sentence. Be fine with going somewhere in between, and a safe first sentence is one that just gets straight to the point. Don't worry about having a super awesome main sentence. Instead, hook the reader by providing the context for your claim. If you are responding to a question or a problem or an alternative view, like assume your readers are curious and interested in things, and you don't have to like manipulate them into being interested with a punchy question. Another thing that often goes into the introductory paragraph is sort of a preview of the paper. And this can be super helpful, and it's also, for a very short paper, less important, so optional. It helps to orient the reader and what to expect, and the more that the reader has a sense of what's to come, the easier it is for them to understand the organization of the paper and how the argument works. But for a very short paper, maybe it's not required. So that is just another standard feature of an introductory paragraph. The last thing that is worth stating in our discussion of intro paragraphs is using first person. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with writing in the first person. I'm not sure why we're so often advised not to write in the first person. If you read academic writing, it's often, very often in the first person. And so here's my advice for writing in the first person. The number one thing you shouldn't do is qualify your claims. So compare some claim X, like some response, like say, the problem with Aristotle's argument is blah, 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 versus I believe the problem with Aristotle's argument is blah, blah, blah. Of course you believe it. It's assumed you believe the things that you're saying. Qualifying it is totally unnecessary, especially since you are not just telling me your opinion, you are giving me reasons for seeing things in an interesting way. You're making a claim and you're proposing it to other people as something that they ought to consider, and here are reasons for doing that. So there's a difference between saying, I argue X, or what I'll consider next is blah, so there are lots of cases where you can use first person language just as the right part of the writing style, or you could use first person language to qualify your claims, to just sort of, oh, well, that's just my opinion or something like that. And I don't want just your opinion. I want you to present claims and reasons for believing them. Give them to me as something I should consider for myself as well, because you might be onto something. So that's my tip for first person. Okay, so for the conclusion, I don't have a lot to say about the conclusion, except do not save your main claim and your most important point as a throwaway statement for the conclusion. This happens a lot, that the real main claim of the argument doesn't come out until the conclusion, and it doesn't get argued for. It's just there's a claim. So make sure that if you end up with the concluding statement having a really interesting claim, that claim actually got argued for in the body of the paper. So don't introduce new main claims in the conclusion. The other thing you don't want to do in your conclusion is totally undermine everything you did in the paper. One way to totally undermine everything you've developed in your paper is to end with who's to say, or everyone has their own opinion. You're to say, that's who. The point of the paper is, what do you say and why? Everyone has their own opinion. What is yours and why? Give your reasoning, because it might be something valuable for other people to think about, right? You have the opportunity to share your reasoning with somebody else. So one reason why, this might seem natural is because maybe you think the task is to be the final arbiter of how we should think about this. And you don't have to see yourself as giving the definitive answer. See yourself as thinking through a complicated question and sharing the conclusions that you draw and the reasons you draw them, because we are working together as a community of human beings interested in figuring out how things are, and perhaps we have some interesting ideas worth sharing with other people, right? So insofar as you have given reasons for your beliefs, that's don't undermine them with there is no answer and who's to say. Okay, so what do you do in a conclusion? Some conclusions are really great, but for the most part, just aim for not writing a crappy one. Sorry, but that's the truth. You can helpfully recap your paper, but a less than awesome conclusion is one that just is your introduction backwards. I feel like that's a thing we learned, right? Just do the reverse of your introduction. That's pretty boring. But if you can sort of helpfully conclude what's happened in the paper, something like a summary of what you've done, or if there is an interesting sort of next oftentimes a paper will end by connecting what was argued for in this paper with a question that would be worth investigating next, or maybe the paper relies upon an assumption that didn't fully get investigated, and so it would be worth going further there. basically the idea is that you can point forward where we should go further if we keep working on this. But if you don't know or have a good sense of what that is, then don't try to do that. So just make your goal to not write a conclusion that sucks. And a conclusion that sucks will be one that has these two problems. Anything short of that is great. Last but not least, just to emphasize this because it is super important, your paper should just be full of citations. You should be engaging deeply with the actual texts, not some SparkNotes version of the text. You read the text for yourself, and you know where, if you are making any kind of reference to the text, you should be providing a citation for where that thing can be found. If you say Plato said a thing, I want to be able to find where he said it. I could go much further into why it matters. It's not just about giving credit where credit is due, but the video is already getting long, so I just want to implore you to provide detailed citations for any reference to the text. It is important. One of the things that is really important to do as a writer is to keep track of those things as you're writing. So hopefully you can draw upon your homework assignments that you've been working on, and hopefully you included all the appropriate citations there, or you can check your notes and your notes contain citations. So get into a writer's habit of including citations anytime you take notes from a text or write up short writing assignments. So that way it isn't this task you do when the paper is done. Including the citations isn't the last step for the paper. It should be included as you're developing the paper, and I promise it's so much easier and way less stressful and less opportunity for you to have sloppy authorship bordering on academic integrity issues. And that wraps up my advice for paper number 2. Good luck, and I enjoy and look forward to hearing what you guys have to say after reflecting on and thinking about Plato and Aristotle's views.